200 guests stood inside that ballroom on the edge of Boston, crystal glasses lifted, waiting for a toast that never came. Bradford Ellison set his glass down instead. He turned to his wife of 14 years, the woman who had raised his son, run his household, and stood quietly behind every promotion he had ever taken credit for, and he smiled the smile people save for strangers. Then he spoke the words that would end everything Naomi Ellison believed about her own life. He told her she had never been a wife. She had been a placeholder, a woman he settled for in his 20s, kept out of convenience, and was finally ready to replace with someone who actually belonged beside a man like him. The room went still in that particular way. A room goes still right before something breaks. Nobody laughed. Nobody reached for her hand. Somewhere near the back, Tiffany Cross lowered her eyes and smiled at her shoes. And 11-year-old Eli gripped the edge of the table, watching his mother's face for some sign of what to do next. Naomi found none of the words she needed. She simply stood there in the blue dress she had saved for months to buy, while 200 people who had eaten at her table pretended very hard to study their napkins instead of her. Brad was not finished. He had an audience now, and he intended to use it. He told the room, loud enough for the caterers to hear, that he had already called a car, that her bags were packed and waiting by the service entrance, that she and the boy would not be spending another night under his roof because there was simply no more room in his life for a woman who had stopped being useful to him years ago. Security did not need to be asked twice. Within minutes, Naomi Ellison walked out through the kitchen doors with her son's hand in hers, past staff who would not meet her eyes, and into a rain that had just begun to fall over the parking lot. She had no idea that the woman he had just thrown into the street was worth more than everything he owned. $5 billion more. Before we get any deeper into how a humiliated wife and her 11-year-old son ended up standing in the rain outside a life they had just lost, connected to a fortune neither of them knew existed, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if you want to be here for every twist still to come, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened to Naomi Ellison that night was only the beginning. Somewhere in a quiet law office 3 states away, a man named Harold Bennett had already spent 11 months trying to track down a woman he had never met. A woman whose name appeared on a single line of a will belonging to a man who had died wealthier than most countries, and who had spent his final years searching for the one relative he had spent decades pretending did not exist. Naomi did not know that man's name. She barely remembered her mother, who had died when she was small, or the gap in her own history that no one in her adoptive family had ever fully explained. She did not know about the locket she had carried since childhood, the one with no photograph inside it, only initials she had never been able to place. She did not know that somewhere in that same city, a woman named Camille Whitmore had already learned a stranger's name was about to appear on a family tree she had spent her whole life believing belonged only to her. All Naomi knew, standing in that parking lot with her son soaked beside her and nowhere left to go, was that the man she had given 14 years of her life to had just called her worthless in front of everyone she knew. She would spend the next several days believing that was the worst thing that could happen to her. She had no way of knowing it was about to become the smallest problem in her life, because the truth waiting to reach her was not going to ask permission, and it was not going to wait for Bradford Ellison to be ready for it either. 6 weeks before that night in the rain, a man named Augustus Whitmore had died alone in a house with 11 bedrooms, most of which had not been opened in over a decade. He left behind a private equity empire, a coastal estate, a name that opened doors in rooms most people never got invited into, and a single line in his will that his own lawyers could not explain. Not a nephew, not a foundation board member, a name none of them recognized, left everything on one condition. She had to be found within 90 days, or the entire $5 billion estate would pass instead to a family trust controlled by his late brother's descendants, a woman named Camille Whitmore chief among them. Harold Bennett had built a quiet, careful career out of finding people who did not want to be found, and people who did not know they were lost. He had never worked a case quite like this one. Somewhere out there was a woman who had no idea her grandfather existed, no idea he had spent his final years searching for her, and no idea that a clock was already running out on a fortune with her name attached to it. Every day that passed without a lead brought Camille Whitmore's legal team closer to the only outcome they wanted, and brought Bennett no closer to a woman who, as far as any adoption record could tell him, had vanished the moment she was born. Naomi Ellison had grown up an orphan in a small town outside Columbus, raised not by blood, but by a woman named Ruth Calloway, a widow who had taken in a baby nobody else wanted and never once made her feel like an obligation. Naomi never knew her birth parents. All she carried from that part of her life was a small gold locket, empty of any photograph, engraved on the inside with two initials she had never been able to place. Ruth raised her to be steady, humble, and grateful for small things. And Naomi grew into exactly that kind of woman. She became a school teacher. She believed in quiet lives well lived, and for a long time, she believed she was living one. She met Bradford Ellison at 26, at a friend's engagement dinner, and she mistook his hunger for ambition and his charm for depth. He told her she made him feel like a better man, and for a while, that was true. They married within a year. Eli was born 3 years later, and for a stretch of time that Naomi would later describe as the only real happiness of her adult life, it seemed like enough. Brad worked, she taught, Eli grew, and the three of them built something that looked, from the outside, exactly like a family that had figured out how to be happy without needing very much at all. But ambition is patient, and it does not stay satisfied for long. As Brad climbed further into corporate circles that valued appearances as much as results, he began to see his own wife differently. Her homemade dinners at office functions became something he apologized for instead of something he was proud of. Her modest wardrobe became a source of quiet embarrassment. He started comparing her, at first only in his own head, to the polished, effortless women who came from the kind of money he had spent his whole life trying to get close to. Naomi noticed the shift long before she understood it. She simply had no name yet for what was happening to her marriage. That name arrived in the form of Tiffany Cross, daughter of Richard Cross, a man whose firm controlled exactly the kind of partnership Brad had been chasing for years. What began as networking dinners Brad insisted were purely professional slowly became something else entirely, and Naomi, distracted by motherhood and her own quiet loyalty, was the last person in that story to see it clearly. By the time she noticed the late nights and the sudden interest in his appearance, in his car, in the version of himself he presented to the world, the affair had already taken root. Brad had convinced himself that Naomi was the only thing standing between him and the life he believed he deserved. Decades earlier, in a different house entirely, Augustus Whitmore had made the same mistake with someone he loved and never got the chance to fix it. His daughter Eleanor had fallen for a schoolteacher named Thomas Hale, a man Augustus considered beneath the family name he had spent his life building. When Eleanor married him anyway, Augustus disowned her outright, certain she would come crawling back once reality set in. She never did. Eleanor died only a few years later, and Thomas, left alone with an infant daughter and a diagnosis of his own that would not let him raise her, made the hardest decision of his life. He placed his baby girl into a closed adoption and kept only one thing from reaching her through the paperwork: a locket, engraved with her mother's initials. Augustus spent the next 3 decades of his life wealthier than almost anyone in the country, and utterly alone inside that wealth. He never remarried. He never repaired what he had broken with Eleanor while she was alive. And when he learned, far too late, that she had died and left behind a daughter he had never once tried to find, something in him finally broke in the other direction. He spent his final years quietly searching for a granddaughter he had never met, driven by a guilt he could no longer outrun. He found nothing conclusive before he died, but he made certain, in his will, that the search would not die with him. Back in the life Naomi actually knew, the pressure at home had been building for weeks before that gala. Brad had one goal: securing Richard Cross's partnership at any cost, and he made it clear to Naomi, without ever quite saying it outright, that her only job that night was not to embarrass him. He corrected the dress she planned to wear. He reminded her twice not to mention Eli's recent struggles at school. Eli, 11 years old and far more perceptive than either parent gave him credit for, watched his mother grow smaller in her own home in the days leading up to that party, and asked her quietly if everything was okay. Naomi told him it would be. She wanted, more than anything, for that to be true. It was a small thing that set the night in motion. The kind of small thing that only matters because someone is already looking for a reason. Naomi mentioned, gently and without any intention of embarrassing anyone, that Eli had been having a hard time adjusting to a new class, hoping Richard Cross's own mention of his grandchildren might open a warm moment between them. Brad heard something else entirely. He heard his wife exposing a weakness in front of the one man whose approval he needed most, and something in him that had been building for months finally came apart in front of 200 witnesses. What followed was the moment already burned into this story from its very first seconds: the humiliation, the reign, the $5 billion truth neither of them yet understood. That first night in the motel, Eli did not cry, which somehow frightened Naomi more than if he had. He sat on the edge of the bed in his damp clothes, watching his mother count the cash in her wallet twice, as if the number might change the second time. She told him it was temporary. She told him they would figure it out together, the way they always had. She did not call anyone that night, not even Ruth, because some part of her was still ashamed, still trying to process how 14 years of her life had ended with her standing outside in the rain being told she was worthless. She would spend the next several days believing that shame was the heaviest thing she would ever have to carry. The days that followed were a quiet, exhausting kind of survival. Naomi called every school within driving distance looking for substitute work. She kept Eli fed on gas station sandwiches and vending machine dinners while trying, every night, to make it feel like less of an emergency than it was. When she finally called Ruth, the older woman did not scold her for waiting so long. She simply told Naomi what she had always told her as a child, that the Callaway women did not fall apart. They figured it out one hard day at a time. It was not much comfort against an empty bank account, but it was enough to keep Naomi moving instead of sinking into the kind of stillness that would have been so easy to fall into. Meanwhile, 3 states away, Harold Bennett's search had finally caught a thread worth pulling. A retired caseworker, tracked down through an old adoption agency file, remembered a placement decades earlier involving a dying father and a baby girl with her mother's initials engraved on a locket. The trail led toward a small town outside Columbus, toward a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had raised a daughter that was never legally hers by blood. For the first time in almost a year, Bennett allowed himself to believe he might actually find her in time. But another name had surfaced first, a woman with a strikingly similar birth record, and Bennett's team spent 3 costly days chasing a lead that ultimately led nowhere, time neither he nor Naomi could afford to lose. Camille Whitmore had never once believed a missing heir would surface before the deadline, and she intended to make certain of it. She hired a private investigator named Frank Doyle, not to help the search, but to slow it down, to raise quiet doubts about the legitimacy of any claim that emerged, and to make sure that if a woman did come forward, she would arrive looking less like a grieving granddaughter and more like an opportunist chasing a fortune. Doyle worked in the background while Camille worked the surface, positioning herself publicly as the reasonable, responsible heir who only wanted to protect her uncle's legacy from strangers. It was, by every measure, a carefully built story. It simply was not a true one. Brad, for his part, had spent the days after that gala rebuilding his own narrative rather than reflecting on it. Now openly living with Tiffany, he framed Naomi's motel living and her financial desperation as proof of instability, and had his lawyer send formal letters questioning her fitness to keep custody of Eli. It was, in its own way, the cruelest twist yet. A man who had thrown his family into the street, now trying to use the consequences of that decision as a weapon against them. Naomi read those letters standing in a motel bathroom, with the door locked, so Eli would not see her hands shaking. And for the first time since that night in the rain, she came dangerously close to believing she might actually lose everything that still mattered to her. What steadied her, in the end, was not a single dramatic moment, but a quiet one. She sat on the edge of that motel bed one night, with the locket in her palm, running her thumb over initials she had traced 1,000 times as a child, without ever understanding them, and she thought of Ruth's voice telling her that the women in this family did not fall apart. She decided, quietly and without any audience to perform it for, that she would fight for Eli with everything she had left, regardless of what Brad's lawyers threatened. She had no idea, in that moment, that the answer to a question she had carried her entire life was less than 48 hours from knocking on her door. Harold Bennett found her on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the motel parking lot with a bag of groceries and Eli trailing beside her. He introduced himself carefully, aware of exactly how strange his next sentence would sound to a woman who had spent her whole life believing she came from nowhere in particular. He told her he represented the estate of a man named Augustus Whitmore. He told her that man had been her grandfather, and he told her, as gently as anyone could deliver a sentence like this, that she was the sole surviving heir to a fortune worth $5 billion, provided she could confirm what every record he had gathered already strongly suggested to be true. Naomi did not cry at first. She simply asked him to repeat it, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. When they did not, the grief arrived before the disbelief did, a strange and specific kind of grief, for a grandfather she had never met, for a mother she barely remembered, for an entire branch of her own history that had existed just out of reach her whole life, while she believed she belonged to no one. She held the locket so tightly, Bennett later remembered the mark it left on her palm. For the first time in her life, the initials engraved inside it had a name, Eleanor Whitmore, her mother. Confirming it legally was its own battle. DNA testing was arranged within the week, and Camille Whitmore's lawyers moved just as quickly, filing a formal challenge in probate court that painted Naomi as a stranger, conveniently surfacing with days to spare, chasing a fortune she had no real connection to. The hearing was tense, procedural, and at times deeply personal, Naomi sitting quietly while attorneys debated her entire existence, as though she were not in the room. But the science did not care about Camille's narrative. When the results came back, they were unambiguous, and so was the judge's ruling. Naomi Ellison was confirmed, by blood and by law, as the sole rightful heir to the Whitmore estate. News like that does not stay contained for long, and it reached Bradford Ellison the same way most consequences eventually catch up to people who never expected them, secondhand, and far too late to control. He heard it from a colleague before Tiffany even had the chance to soften the blow, and in that moment, the full weight of what he had thrown away in a single cruel speech became impossible to ignore. He had called the mother of his child worthless, in front of 200 people to protect an image, and that same woman was now worth more than every deal, every partnership, and every version of success he had spent his entire adult life chasing. Brad showed up at the modest apartment Naomi had since moved into with Eli, flowers in hand, apologies rehearsed, framing his return as something owed to their family rather than something he was asking for. He spoke about second chances. He spoke about Eli needing his father. Naomi listened to all of it standing calmly in her own doorway, and recognized, with a clarity that would have been impossible for her only weeks earlier, that nothing about the man in front of her had actually changed. He was not sorry for what he had done to her. He was sorry it had cost him something he wanted. She closed the door gently, and for the first time in 14 years, she did not feel guilty for doing it. Tiffany Cross did not stay long after that. Once the story became public, Richard Cross quietly withdrew the partnership he had spent months courting Brad for, unwilling to have his name associated with a scandal that painted his daughter as complicit in another woman's public humiliation. Without the partnership, without the image, and without the fortune Brad had bet everything on eventually controlling through Naomi, Tiffany's interest evaporated almost overnight. Brad, who had once stood in a crowded ballroom, certain he was trading up, found himself standing in an empty apartment months later with nothing left of the life he had thrown his family away to build. Naomi's life, by contrast, settled into something steadier than she had ever known, even before that night in the rain. She used a portion of her inheritance to establish a small foundation in her mother's name, quietly supporting women rebuilding their lives after being discarded the way she once had been, and she made sure Eli grew up understanding that the money mattered far less than what they chose to do with it. Ruth Calloway moved closer, insisting she was too old to miss out on watching her grandson grow up properly. And Naomi kept the locket, no longer a mystery, worn now as a reminder of exactly how far she had come from a parking lot in the rain. There is a version of this story where a woman is humiliated, thrown out into the street with her son, and simply disappears into a hard, quiet life nobody ever hears about again. This was not that story. Naomi Ellison did not need Bradford Ellison's name, his money, or his permission to matter. She had been worth $5 billion the entire time he stood in that ballroom deciding she was worthless, and the truth eventually found her anyway, exactly when she needed it most. The only real question left is the one worth sitting with. If the man who threw you away came back the moment your worth became impossible to ignore, would you have let him back in? We want to hear your honest answer in the comments below, and we would love to know where in the world you're watching this from tonight. If a story like Naomi's moved you, wait until you hear what happened in our next case. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.